It's my pleasure to moderate our panel this afternoon on domestic responses to terrorism. I'll start things off just by briefly introducing each of our three speakers in the order in which they will speak. Then I'll turn it over to them. Each will be speaking for about 20 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A because this session is scheduled to run until 5:30. To start things off, we have Farah Pandith, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at Harvard University. Farah has served in a variety of positions, including with the U.S. government, including on the National Security Council, USAID, and the U.S. State Department. Next up, we have David Shanzer, who is Associate Professor of the Practice at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, and the Director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security. Before coming to Duke, David served in a variety of positions in both the executive and congressional branches of the U.S. government, particularly dealing with questions involving the law. Finally, we have Peter O'Brien, who is Professor of Political Science at Trinity University. He's an expert on European politics and has written a number of books on Islam in Europe. So, to kick things off, I'd like to hand it over to Farah, please.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the worst timing. You guys have just had sugar. It's the middle of the afternoon. So I'm going to try to inspire you. That's what my job's going to be for the next 20 minutes. And I want to start by talking about elephants. Because the last panel said that there was an elephant in the room. And I want to remind you that elephants are not creatures that live by themselves. Elephants are social creatures. They understand what's around them. They understand culture and they care about each other. The work that I've been doing for over a decade has been around that soft, squishy stuff about culture and societies and communities. And someone asked a question during the last panel about what do we do about this and how do we stop the movement of ideas, bad ideas, that infect young kids and have them move towards terrorist organizations. So what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the experience I had when I was in government. The one thing you did forget to say on the National Security Council, not only did I serve the NSC, but I served with Marin. So that's actually the most important part of the bio. So I want to tell you what I think the problem is, and I want to be really clear that the kind of extremist groups that I'm speaking about are those that use Islam as a motivating means, okay? And it's important to say that because in 2017, at the end of 2017, we are looking at the rise of all kinds of other extremist groups that in fact are connected because nothing lives in a vacuum. Nothing is siloed. So what's happening in the space around impacts young people, whether they happen to be Muslim or not. And the reason I'm focusing on Muslims and what I'm about to say is because ISIS, AQ, Boko, and others are not trying to prey upon and radicalize Hindus and Christians and Jews. They're going after young Muslims under the age of 30, primarily around the world. So the first piece of this, in terms of what the problem is I'm talking to you about 1/4 of the planet. Okay, 1/4 of the planet is Muslim. Almost 1 billion of that number is under the age of 30. 1 billion. That's the demographic that they're going after. Okay, I want to be clear about that. I reject the idea that this is regional, that we're talking about the Middle East, or we're talking about Africa, or we're talking about, I'm going to push back against the title of this, a domestic issue. For millennials, there is no such thing as domestic and international. You all know how digital natives operate. You all are very well aware that ideas have no borders. There are no walls that you can build to stop ideas from flowing. So when we're talking about the threat of extremists that we're trying to get ahead of, I thought it was interesting that someone in the panel before talked about success, what we meant by success. I want to be clear that what I mean by success is not eradicating extremism from the planet, although that might be nice. I'm not Pollyanna. What I'm trying to do in the work that I will be discussing is moving the needle enough so that the vast majority of young people who are Muslim, who are preyed upon by groups like AQ and ISIS and others, do not find the ideology of an us versus them appealing. So much so that not only do they jump off and become violent, which is the CT aspect of this, but all of the mush in between when you're a normal kid and you start moving down a path of finding that ideology interesting. In the Bush administration, that ideological component was called the war of ideas. That's what they meant when they said the war of ideas. And when Marin and I were at the White House, right after 9/11, that's in fact what we worked on. Trying to understand where we could put the kinetic and the non-kinetic. On the hard power piece, what do we have to do with our military might, our law enforcement, our sanctions, our following the money for the terrorist organizations? What needed to be done, what had to be done there? But what could be done in that space that was really gushy and really hard to deal with, that soft power space where we wanted to make sure we got into the opportunity to provide counter content to the young people that were being preyed upon by extremist groups. That and the 2006 National Security Strategy is called Countering Violent Extremism, CVE. Everything else you think CVE is not. I know, because I've been doing this for a decade. And what has happened in 2017 is that everybody thinks everything to do with, quote, whatever this means, winning hearts and minds, unquote, is CVE. Everybody thinks surveillance is CVE. Everybody thinks every kind of law enforcement method is CVE. That's not CVE. What CVE is the ideological pushback on the ideologies of the bad guys, so that we provide counter content and provide resilience. I loved that word that was used earlier today. Resilience within communities so that they at a local level understand what's happening to their youth, and we as society in general can prevent the ideology from sticking. How do you do that? How do you stop that from happening? Well, over the course of the last 16 years, when we have been dealing with a post-9/11 environment, government has been really good, if you want to use that term, at understanding the measurement and the success models on the kinetic war. We're not so good at understanding what success and measurement might be in the non-kinetic sphere. Soft power is not something that is really comfortable for government to talk about. We think it's about propaganda, and recently the conversations you're hearing about ISIS are all about the online space. Guess what? Things that happen in the online space don't first happen in the online space. Something is happening to you in the offline space. What is happening? From my perspective, and I want to be clear, I am not an academic, and there are people in this room who have spent their lifetimes in the spheres that they have researched and understand. I am simply going to tell you from my experience of seeing young Muslims in more than 80 countries around the world and talking to tens of thousands of Muslims under the age of 30, that the one unique factor that connects them all has been a crisis of identity. And from that crisis of identity in a post-9/11 world where they are asking questions of what does it mean to be modern and Muslim? What's the difference between culture and religion? As they've navigated those questions, the bad guys have been there to answer the questions for them at a rate and a pace and an environment that allows them to get ready-made answers that don't actually correspond with their cultural backgrounds, with their heritages, of their own particular life stories, family stories. Marin earlier talked to you about the underwear bomber. I want to remind you that this is a kid who grew up in Nigeria, who was very wealthy. His father was a banker. He was studying in London and went online and asked Sheikh Google, why doesn't my family eat halal meat? I ask you, why is he asking Sheikh Google about that? Why isn't he asking his parents or his brother or sister, his cousins, what's up in our house? Why aren't we eating halal meat? It was more important for him as a millennial to find out what Google said than to ask from family. And for those of you who are millennials, you're all actually shaking your heads because you know peers make a difference. What Sheikh Google says is cool. It's not what your parents says. In earlier generations, everybody goes through identity crisis. Every single one of us go through identity crisis. Who am I? What am I doing? But what's unique about post 9/11 is that there's been a consistent drumbeat, online and offline, of what it means to have purpose and belonging and meaning if you are a Muslim. And for some kids who are navigating that identity, let's remind ourselves, the demographic that we're talking about is young. A human brain does not get developed until the age of 24. And what government has done is try to develop a system of going after the ideology without the corresponding pieces that make it clear to all of us on what needs to be done. I go back to the elephants. We are societies of people. There are many touch points that happen to kids as they're growing up inside the home and outside of the home. So the strategies that governments have come up with have been important in a couple of different ways. One, we've understood and we've learned this the hard way, that you can't go top down. You can't go with the guy with the longest beard and the highest hat and say, hey, follow that kind of Islam over there. Or that guy over there is going to tell you how to be a good Muslim. You think an 18-year-old cares? What we understood in the Bush administration by the end of it was that everything is local. That we had to listen to what the grassroots were saying. We had to find ways of building the connectivity at the grassroots level with influencers, with peer groups, and hypercharge the counter narratives in a multitude of different ways so that all that they were seeing is 24/7 surround sound counter content. All of society, Muslims and non-Muslims. When Obama came in as president, unfortunately, much of what we had learned took many years to be listened to. Because the philosophy was, and I am a political in both the Bush and Obama administration, so I'm not coming at this from I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, I'm simply telling you facts. It took a long time until the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism, not that that was the watershed moment of the world, but at least it was an opportunity for us to understand, whoa, wait a minute, those NGOs at the local level, they have something to do here. It isn't just about religious groups that are going to tell kids how to be a Muslim. It isn't just about what we think is the right brand of Islam. That we had to listen to what was happening and, hey, by the way, can we build networks of like-minded thinkers and make sure that we populate the environment with their counter content? And can we, this is so important, can we find former extremists to tell the stories of what it means to be radicalized, to be part of a group, to come back out and talk one-on-one with the kid who is beginning to find this of interest. This is the model that can work. Why have we failed then? We are failing. The extremists are winning. You heard the numbers in the kinetic war in Afghanistan. You heard the numbers in the kinetic war in Iraq in the panel before. Pennies on the dollar in the soft power space. Pennies on the dollar. In fact, 0.073% of what we've spent since 9/11 on the soft power war. Why is that? Why haven't we gone to the largest possible field of people who know how to handle this kind of thing? Who are those people? People like you. People like me. People who are interested in building resilience in communities. So, what is the answer to this? The answer is what I call open power. And I've written a book that's coming out next year called How We Win. And in it, I talk about how we do this and do it right, because the solutions are affordable and available. Government needs to be focused on this. They need to put a strategy in place. By the way, we do not have a CVE strategy, okay? We need a strategy. But the strategy of hard and soft power need to be integrated, and they need to be given as much respect as each other, and the focus and the time and the money that we need. The private sector is not just about takedown of technology companies who can take bad content off. This is about every kind of private industry, understanding that they have data that tells us what kind of coffee we're going to drink and how often you're going to take a sip of water. That data, that human data, that behavioral data can help us build resilient communities if we apply it in the right way. This is not talking about Big Brother watching over you. It's about understanding what's happening to young kids at age 7, at age 12, at age 18, at age 21. Where are the mental health experts in this conversation? Do you think the US government has plugged in the very best of the neuroscientists and the anthropologists and the historians? Have they included this in how we build solutions? No, they haven't. How do you get a community to build resilience if we haven't done this, is my question. And that's what has to be done. When I talk about open power, I mean opening up the aperture and making open power available for us all, opening up the opportunity for you to make a difference in how we do this. And I know that it seems far-fetched, and I know it seems insane with all of the rise of hate speech that's happening in the world today. But what we also know is that things happen at a granular level. And we need a 24/7 surround sound system where kids are feeling like identity, that they can explore that identity in safe spaces, where they understand that it's okay to be who they are and ask the questions they are and not have to go to Shake Google for the answers for that. I have 1 minute left, and I want to say one last thing. So when we're talking about the threat that we're facing, I began by telling you about how many Muslims are on the planet today, and I want to end with what's coming. Somebody earlier said you can't predict what's happening, but I can tell you what's been missing in our conversation about CVE is vision. We haven't envisioned the worst. We haven't envisioned what it will mean if we don't go all in. It isn't just about how uncomfortable it's going to be for you to walk down the street and look over your shoulder to see whether or not a car is rambling at you in a way that's not supposed to be the norm. It's not just about making sure when you enter a mall that you know what exits to go out if some weirdo shooter starts off. It isn't just about you wondering about your 13-year-old kid who might be reading weird stuff online. It's about we as a society giving up who we are because a random group of crazy guys have decided that they can game the system. We're better than that. We know more than that. We know about human behavior. And I want to end by saying envisioning what's going to happen means understanding the impact of the foreign fighters that are coming back, understanding the impact of technology as it grows, and understanding what will happen if we don't go all in. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Farah. Over to you, David.
She was great.
Well, that was fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been treated to one of the world's authorities on this topic. Not our national authority, one of the world's authorities. So what a treat to have Farah, an amazing public servant. Thank you also to my colleague Peter, who we're going to meet later, and I'm really looking forward to your talk as well. But it's a little hard to follow that, but actually Farah has set up something I wanted to explain. It's a kind of a tragic story, but it's going to build on what she was talking about, because the truth of the matter is that we've had some well-intentioned people in the government who tried to implement a CVE strategy, tried to develop and implement a CVE strategy, and it was a total belly flop. So I think it's an important story to tell, principally because it's something I studied to know about and written about, so I have something to tell you. But also, as we move forward with the kinds of initiatives that Farah is speaking about, that maybe we'll learn some lessons about what not to do and what to do better. So I had a whole part of my talk try to explain what CV is and the philosophy behind it, but now I don't have to do that, which is great. We'll get to Klaus's refreshments more quickly that way. But certainly it's about the notion of community-based solutions, building resilience, partnerships between the private sector, the citizenry, and government. It's about intervention strategies that can help young people who are headed in the wrong direction and get them headed back in the right direction. Farah mentioned mental health, but we have other social services entities that can participate in doing that. It's also a little bit about trying to identify people who are going to do something bad at an early stage, try to get them off that path, but at least then prevent them from engaging in violence, because every time we have an incident, it just makes the problem so much worse and so much more difficult. So the things we do in terms of identifying and arresting when necessary, is critical part of this, because when we can prevent those things from occurring, then the problem doesn't get worse, more people don't get radicalized, and you don't get the backlash from the citizenry and all of the bad mistakes and bad policies that come from when we make policy out of fear as opposed to rationality. So that is what I envision as CVE, and the Obama administration took a little while, but did put out a document, a strategy in August of 2011. So what is that, 2.5 years into the administration, to try to say, here's what we're going to do. And my personal view is that it was a reasonable effort. It had a good objective. It had a decent theoretic basis, that we know a little bit about how to prevent people from getting into gangs and anti-crime and youth violence prevention, and we could draw on those lessons. So it had something of a academic theoretic basis. It also, I think, had a good, decent political basis, which is, we can't arrest our way out of this terrorism problem. Reducing terrorism is not only good for all Americans, it's especially good for Muslim Americans, because if we can have fewer terrorism, their life is going to be a lot better. And we need, to, as Farah said, merge the coercive, kinetic elements of counterterrorism with the softer side of prevention. So there was a good political grounds. The sad story is that the entire thing was totally botched. And let me explain why. A couple of different reasons. And essentially it was the way it was developed, rolled out, and the way the problem was framed by very smart and well-intentioned people. None of them are here today, so hopefully they're still my friends. But the key mistake was essentially not ensuring that the core constituency that was going to be necessary to implement and politically accept this set of proposals was involved and bought in to the strategy before it was rolled out and made essentially a White House issued presidential document. That's like Politics 101, and it was totally failed. It was developed at a high level. I don't know where Farah was when this was being done, but maybe she can tell us later. But it was developed out of the National Security Council staff, and you heard the kinds of things that need to be done in this space so eloquently from Farah, who thinks a bunch of national security detailees from a variety of national security agencies, which is what the NSC is, knows how to do that. Well, that's where it was developed. And it didn't have the political buy-in from them. Second, the whole initiative was framed as an aspect of counterterrorism law enforcement. The strategy document, they made an effort at making it a little softer, but it was called Empowering Partnerships Between Law Enforcement and Communities to Counter Violent Extremism. So a couple big problems with that is that it was all about law enforcement. Who were identified as the key partners that were going to implement our national strategy? Well, it was the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security. Those were the 4 agencies that were designated to implement this strategy to somehow come up with a social science response to preventing people from radicalizing. So this was essentially rolled out and conceptualized, and therefore received by the community as an adjunct of the national security law enforcement process. And essentially you can't create a prevention program that is going to require the buy-in of families, individuals, communities, and clerics if you are saying, we need you to help us stop the terrorism problem. By the way, we're talking to you because, well, you must know all the terrorists. And that's what the message really of the whole way the thing was set up. Even the terminology countering violent extremism, most of the people you were going to interact with were going to say, well, what do I have to do with violent extremism. Why are you talking to me? Another reason that the program couldn't get off the ground was because, although it did a good job of using neutral rhetoric to say that there were all different forms of extremism in the United States and this program is going to be aimed at all of them, that was, it was a lie. It was a lie. Because the resources, the people who were talking about it, all of the efforts that were listed literally in the implementation were things that were only being done for one form of extremism in the United States, which is extremism inspired by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and like-minded groups, and had nothing to do with the equally pernicious and prevalent form of extremism that is anti-government, that is anti-Semitic, that is right-wing extremism, white supremacist, and so on. We now know, and I've been saying this for many years. Unfortunately, my friend Charles Kurzman, who's my partner in crime, isn't, there he is. We've been saying for years that we have two forms of terrorism problems in the United States, and they are virtually equal magnitudes when it comes to looking at incidents and deaths. It doesn't matter what measurement you use. Lo and behold, a couple of years ago, we had the FBI director announcing that there were 900 open investigations relating to ISIS in all 50 states. And that sounds like a whole lot, and it is. But just in September, we had the director of the FBI mentioning that there are 1,000 open right-wing extremism investigations by the FBI in the United States right now. So we have two problems of extremism, but this program, by rhetoric it said it was by across the board, but in practice it was exclusively directed at one form of extremism, and that felt unfair. It felt discriminatory, and again, that was causing the groups not to want to buy in. Finally, the other big problem with the program is that it was announced, but it was a total empty shell. No designation of a lead agency, $0 of resources, no line item in the budget, no administrative structure to implement, no program structure of any sort. It was a list of accomplishments, a list of activities designed to pretend to be a strategy that was just designed to point at and say, we're doing something, without really any chance of moving forward, and of course, it didn't. So the result was that we had an initiative that had lots of functional problems, but ultimately had absolutely no constituency. The first groups, you had, of course, the kind of anti-Islam, the Islamophobia industry in the United States, and the groups that said anything Obama did was wrong and soft. Of course, they were going to be against it, and they were. They said this is a payoff to the Muslim Brotherhood, this is Obama paying off all of his friends, this is a squishy way to divert attention from the real problem, which is radical Islamic extremism, and so on and so forth. Now, they were never going to be for it, and the program could have still succeeded without their support. But the problem is it lost a huge portion of the Muslim American community. Say what you like about the CARE and the Council on American Islamic Relations. People have differing views on them, but the bottom line is that they are very powerful in the community. They have a lot of constituencies. We did two studies, the one 5 years apart from the next. When we went out to the field to do the second study, basically everybody we tried to communicate with, they had to check with CARE before they could talk to us, which showed me that CARE had really done its grassroots work. So you don't like CARE, that's fine, but if you want to have a program that's going to touch and affect Muslim Americans, you better have CARE on your side, because if you don't, it ain't going to work. I can tell you that right now. So why didn't the Muslim American community agree with the program? How much time do I have?
About 6 minutes.
Perfect. First of all, they thought that the CVE was an adjunct of surveillance because it was being run by the security community, and they had experienced multiple instances when they believed that their community had been spied on by the FBI or by the NSA, some of which was fantasy and fiction. Other smaller episodes were realistic, but they believed, and they made arguments Those who never wanted to be participate or didn't believe in these programs thought it was a subterfuge for surveillance. They believed that CVE was trying to encourage disharmony within their community by identifying potential informants, and that was a threat to the very fabric of their community itself. They believed that CVE was unnecessary because the amount of violence caused by terrorism inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS in America is a very small sliver of the violence problem we have in America. And that was discounted, that the violence is overinflated and not as much of a problem. And there's a lot of facts to bear on that. I've tried these statistics in multiple different ways, but I'll try another one with you this afternoon that I dreamed up yesterday, which is that we've had about 8 homicides per year since 9/11 caused by individuals inspired or by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and like-minded groups. So about 8 homicides per year over the span of 16 years. We have 8 homicides in America every 4 to 5 hours. So in the time that we have had this conference, 8 people have been killed, murdered in the United States of America. So this violence is a small sliver of the problem of violence in America, and they have a fair point on that. They believe that CVE suppresses the free speech rights of Muslim Americans because they believe that anytime somebody speaks out on something relating to the Middle East or their views on Israel, Palestine, their views, frankly, about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, what's going on in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, everything we've been talking about, they believe that could be used as evidence that they might be radicalizing towards violence and therefore should be subjected to surveillance. So they think that speech is evidence, or that the government believes under this program, speech is evidence of radicalization. They believe that CVE, the whole notion of it, and the way it was framed, casts suspicion on all Muslim Americans as potential terrorists. And they especially believe that CVE was bitterly unfair because it didn't ask the same obligations on white citizens, non-Muslim citizens, to take action, build resilience, do all the things that Farah talked about against radical right-wing extremism, but they, as Muslim Americans, were being asked that their patriotic duty to take certain actions that weren't being made by others. So those are some powerful reasons, and basically that the program essentially led to the result that you never got any sort of community participation, or split the Muslim community right down the middle, or maybe not even the middle. I'd say more 60-40 or 70-30 against this participation. You were never really going to get it to work. I'm running out of time. There are a couple things that happened that made matters even worse, most of which were caused by the FBI. They put out a website that, based on an icon, it looked like a Gitmo torture victim called Don't Be a Puppet, to try to convince people not to take up extremism, which was, in my view, offensive and a disaster. The FBI also announced that they would be in charge of all the intervention programs to help get people off of radicalization, all the mental health and the psycho teams that were going to help people. Oh, and by the way, they were going to have access to any of the practitioner treatment notes, and that the surveillance and prosecutions of people who went into the program would continue while they were in the program. That was not a recipe for success or a way to build public confidence. Farah mentioned the CVE summit, and I think there was much good and ideas that came out of it, but I thought a terrible thing to do was to essentially have a day 1 on domestic extremism and day 2 on everything happening internationally, because I think it was a signal to Muslim Americans that we envisioned the problems as being on the same magnitude, and it was, I think, properly interpreted as a message that the U.S. government believes that we have the same kind of problem about violent extremism, the same magnitude of problem here in America, and we're taking action against it as is taking place, when there's large-scale mass insurgencies against states throughout the Middle East. I mean, it is a very, very different problem, and I think it was really a problem to equate those through that summit. Well, anyway, the Obama administration policy was beginning to get a little momentum. They were beginning to repair some of the damage, but the time ran out on the administration. They had a little budget, a little bit of bipartisan support, some demonstration projects that were going to take place out in the field to try to deal with this, but they literally ran out of time. The awards were made before the contracts were entered. And then the Trump administration comes in and redoes a bunch of the contracts. They actually cancel one of the key contracts that went to a group. Well, the most key one was the one here at UNC with Corey, but the other key one was one that was going to focus exclusively on right-wing extremism. Surprise, surprise, that was one that got on the chopping block. The entire budget for the office that run the director of the office, which was ultimately created and put in DHS, resigned. The budget for that office and the grant program has been totally zeroed out. So the CVE effort in the United States is dead, over. It's not going to happen until we have a new administration. That said, I'm going to wrap up here, but that said, I think people like Farah and people like myself, we know that we have no choice but to loop back to this at some point. It's not going to happen during this current administration, but hopefully the lessons that we've learned, and hopefully when everybody in the world reads my paper when it ultimately comes out that will tell this story, when we have to come back to it, we'll understand the lessons a lot better, and maybe when we get to it, we'll do a lot better job. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this very exciting panel. I hope I can keep it up here. I need my images here. Is that you say F5? No. I think that's mine. I just keep... There it goes. Thank you. Okay. So, at least since the publication of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962, we are tuned to scientists' propensity to exaggerate order. Today I want to draw attention to three prominent theories in the comparative study of counterterrorism that exaggerate order in terms both of normative, or what you might think of as rhetorical consensus, and empirical or policy coherence. I label these methodological nationalism, European exceptionalism, and transatlantic convergence. Methodological nationalism posits important differences in the policies of nation-states based on their nationally specific histories, cultures, and institutions. The most common contrast in the study of counterterrorism is that between France and the UK. France purportedly combines insistence on cultural assimilation with tight surveillance and policing of unassimilated Muslims, with the ultimate threat of detention or deportation. The UK supposedly mixes facilitation of multiculturalism with conciliation towards Islamic communities and organizations expected to police themselves. European exceptionalism represents an extrapolation of methodological nationalism from the nation-state to the continent. What could awkwardly be called methodological continentalism theorizes significant differences between U.S. American and European approaches. The U.S. government purportedly employs a militaristic strategy to thwart terrorism that exhibits little concern for civil rights and society, while European governments, France sometimes excepted, allegedly prefer a far less invasive combination of domestic policing and de-radicalization. Often heavily influenced by the Foucauldian concepts of governmentality, the third school discerns a transatlantic convergence, especially since 9/11. European governments have purportedly emulated the USA by securitizing immigration and trampling on the civil and human rights of immigrants of Muslim heritage. In addition to criticizing the three theories for exaggerating order, I offer an admittedly partial and provisionary explanation of disorder, or what I call messiness, that is rooted in normative discord. I maintain that persistent, salient, normative discord can generate not only political conflict, but also ethical inconclusivity, coupled with tolerance for moral inconsistency and policy incoherence. Now, there exists much evidence that European politicians and states are committed to human rights in the fight against terrorism. The normative core of liberalism prescribes equality and freedom for all individuals, regardless of race, nationality, gender, religion, and the like. An optimistic version of liberalism posits that guaranteeing equal rights to Muslims is ultimately the surest weapon against terrorism. Inversely, denying equal rights is the surest way to foment terrorism. Often dubbed winning hearts and minds or soft power, some version or other of this notion figures prominently in the political discourse regarding terrorism in Europe. In 2003, for example, Interior Minister Sarkozy claimed that it is, quote, catastrophic to deny the cultural and religious identity of Muslims. An identity denied is an identity that radicalizes. In 2011, in regard to young Muslims who entertain the idea of embracing radical Islamism, Prime Minister Cameron conceded that, quote, we have failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. The liberal norm has affected much policy. All EU member states recognize the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 3 protects against torture. Article 5 guarantees liberty and security. And Article 6 demands a fair and public trial. Of course, sovereign states do not have to abide by the convention, but when they do not, they can and often do find themselves hauled before the European Court of Human Rights. In 2010, for instance, the court postponed the extradition from the United Kingdom to the United States of 5 terrorist suspects until in 2012, the US government agreed not to pursue the death penalty or to try them before military tribunals. National courts have also trenchantly defended human rights. For example, in 2004 and again in 2008, Britain's High Court struck down bills that allowed for lengthy detention of foreign terrorist suspects without charges. In 2009, a Paris appeals court exonerated 3 terrorist suspects because the charges against them were based on unlawful interrogations conducted by French agents in the US military prison at Guantanamo. Likewise, Germany's Constitutional Court in 2016 rejected as excessive invasion of privacy a number of surveillance practices legalized by the reform of the Federal Criminal Agency law of 2009. Lawmakers have not left it to courts alone to guarantee equal rights for Muslims. Prompted by the Racial Equality Directive issued by the European Council in 2000, most European governments have established anti-discrimination agencies charged with exposing and eliminating prejudice against Muslims. But there is equally compelling evidence for transatlantic convergence, and therefore against European exceptionalism. No European state confines its counterterrorism strategy to soft power. Hard power strategies presuppose the existence of militants actively plotting to commit acts of terrorism on European soil. All European governments authorize surveillance by their police and intelligence service of Islamist organizations, including even those with which the governments formally cooperate. These and other hard power measures are supported and legitimized by the clash of civilizations paradigm. You all know it, right? It posits that Muslims have a greater propensity for violence, including political theocratic terrorism. Versions of it are regularly professed by prominent public intellectuals, best-selling books, and popular Islamophobic websites. What Michael Murphy calls the gross exaggeration of the Islamic threat has clearly influenced policymakers who want to be seen to be protecting their country from the perceived menace. A particularly consequential aspect of this reaction issues forth through the declaration of a new kind of terrorism that demands extraordinary measures. In the aftermath of 7/7, Tony Blair exclaimed, quote, "Let no one be in any doubt. The rules of the game are changing." The war metaphor is very common. President Hollande, following the Paris attacks of 2015, maintained that France found itself at war against terrorism. Likewise, after the Munich and Ansbach attacks of 2016, Chancellor Merkel asserted, "We are in a war against ISIS." To deal with this novel breed of war, European governments have enacted hard power measures in ways not unreminiscent of the USA Patriot Act. As mentioned, the methodological nationalism paradigm highlights France with regard to hard power. And indeed, in the wake of the 1995 Paris metro bombings, France did expand its Vigie-Parat emergency plan to allow French troops to be deployed to assist police, suspects to be arrested and held for 4 days without access to a lawyer, and non-Frenchmen to be summarily deported if suspected of involvement with terrorism. Following the Paris attacks of November 2015, President Hollande immediately declared a state of emergency, which was extended by the National Assembly 6 times, and with the anti-terror bill of 2017 essentially made into permanent law. The United Kingdom, conventionally dubbed soft on terrorism due to a penchant for protecting civil liberties, has in fact passed legislation similar to that of France. Even before 9/11, Parliament had enacted the Terrorism Act of 2000, Section 44 of which authorized police in designated areas to stop and search any persons regardless of whether they are suspected of terrorist activity. The 2001 Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act permitted the government to derogate from the European Convention on Human Rights due to, quote, a state of emergency threatening the life of the nation. The Cameron government also finessed through Parliament the Justice and Security Act of 2013, which legalized the denial of prosecutorial evidence to defendants suspected of committing or aiding acts of terror. The German government too has exercised hard power. The Bundestag legislated in 2002 and renewed in 2007 the law to combat terrorism. Among other things, it vastly expanded the power of police and intelligence agencies to monitor and archive private information from financial transactions to telephone correspondence to internet surfing. A 2009 law made it legal to deport resident aliens suspected but not guilty of committing terrorism, and in 2014, Germany instituted a ban on exiting the country even for German Islamists suspected of aiding ISIS. The EU has also endorsed hard power, with arguably very adverse consequences for human rights. For example, in 2004, the European arrest warrant came into effect. It obligates member states to extradite their own nationals to other member states where they are convicted or suspected of serious crimes. Human rights concerns have been raised because some member states, for example Spain, have much tougher laws against terrorism. The exaggerated war rhetoric and mentality lead to disproportionate and even lawless use of hard power against Muslims. In the name of fighting terrorism, millions of Muslims have been electronically monitored, thousands physically searched or arrested, and hundreds convicted, jailed, or deported. In addition, dozens of Islamic organizations have been banned or defunded. Indeed, it's very likely that the victims of counterterrorism today far outnumber the victims of terrorism. Despite the prohibition of torture, European states have enabled it. For instance, a European Parliament investigation found Germany and the United Kingdom, among other countries, in unequivocal violation of the European Convention on Human Rights for tolerating or facilitating renditions of suspected Muslim terrorists by the CIA to black sites. Given the profound lack of transparency of cross-national information sharing, like that negotiated in the 2005 Prüm Convention, and cross-national counterterrorism working groups like the G6, it's impossible to know what, if any, laws they are breaking behind closed doors. Finally, we should not overlook the fact that government officials are known at times to turn a blind eye to acts of terrorizing violence against Muslims perpetrated by private citizens. Indeed, few governments even collect statistics on anti-Muslim violence, let alone assiduously prosecute it. Perhaps the most, I'm not on the right, perhaps the most infamous case involved the exposure of several employees of Germany's Agency for the Protection of the Constitution as alleged sympathizers with the National Socialist Underground, whose Zwickau cell murdered 9 immigrants, 8 Muslims, and a police officer. Now, I mentioned the common assertion of methodological nationalism that France prefers hard power. The French case is typically contrasted with the UK, which is supposed to prefer multiculturalism and especially what's called community-based counterterrorism. Also referred to as self-policing, community-based counterterrorism reposes on the idea that it is fellow Muslims using Islamic reasoning and exhortation who can best persuade other Muslims to eschew terrorism. There is much evidence that of this approach in the UK. After 9/11, the Blair government made the Muslim Council of Britain into a quasi-official interlocutor. The Prime Minister made numerous high-profile appearances with leaders of the organization. Following the 2 bombings in 2005, the Home Office turned primarily to the Muslim Council to formulate Preventing Extremism Together, now usually just mentioned as PREVENT. Through its subsequently devised programs, hundreds of millions of pounds were channeled to local Islamic associations to enable them to devise initiatives designed to offer a rejection of terrorism that was rooted in Islamic doctrine. But we can also find evidence for this same approach to counterterrorism in France. In response to 9/11, Sarkozy insisted that the Union of Islamic Organizations in France, despite its alleged connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, be included in the newly formed French Council of the Muslim Religion. The then Interior Minister and his advisors maintained that the Union disavowed political violence, had an impressive organizational infrastructure with long tentacles throughout the Muslim community that gave it clout on the streets, and therefore represented the most effective agent for persuading young Muslims to abstain from terrorism. What we should be afraid of, Sarkozy explained to his detractors, is, quote, Islam gone astray. Garage Islam. Now, similar reasoning moved German Interior Minister Schäuble to insist that the Islamische Gemeinschaft Milli Geruch, despite its ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, be invited to join the Deutsche Islamkonferenz, officially sponsored by the Interior Ministry since 2006. And his the subsequent Interior Minister, Thomas de Maizière, remarked that, quote, Muslims in Germany, especially imams, can make an important contribution to the prevention of terrorism. However, the Islamist organization was expelled from the Deutsche Islamkonferenz in 2010 based on charges of unconstitutional behavior from the Agency for the Protection of the Constitution, which was, of course, keeping it under surveillance. But then it was subsequently reinstated in 2014 due to its broad appeal within the Muslim community. It seems that the officials in the Interior Ministry realized that a Deutsche Islamkonferenz, with the official goal of, quote, preventing extremism, radicalization, and social polarization, but without Milli Geruch, had little credibility with its target audience. Now, the EU also supports community-based efforts. Here's a quote from the European Council in 2005. We need to empower moderate voices by engaging with Muslim organizations and faith groups that reject the distorted version of Islam put forth by Al-Qaeda and others. And in 2009, the EU launched Community Policing, Preventing Radicalization and Terrorism, that's the name of the act, which encourage police to work in concert with community agents. Okay, so to wrap up, if any identifiable, theories usually are looking for patterns, right? Well, if any identifiable pattern or convergence across these representative regimes is visible, it is policy messiness, that is, ethically inconsistent and practically contradictory policies. The same governments that solemnly resolve to respect human rights in the fight against terrorism, and often do so, also endorse and enact laws that regularly violate the human rights of guilty and innocent Muslims. The same governments that vow to cooperate only with Muslims who unequivocally state and demonstrate their commitment to liberal democratic principles fund and enable Islamist organizations because their supposedly anti-Western disposition is thought to give them more street clout among actual and potential extremists. Moreover, many of these same associations are placed under police surveillance, which in turn often leads them or their sponsoring governments to break off relations with them. So, due in large part to the predominance of theories that underscore order, the explanation of disorder or policy messiness, in my opinion, remains undeveloped or underdeveloped. What I've tried to do in much larger work called The Muslim Question in Europe that I published last year is to show that normative discord is a major element here. There really is no moral consensus in Europe regarding how best to combat violent Islamist extremism. And the elusive agreement is hardly unique to counterterrorism. As Zygmunt Bauman has observed, ours is not an age of consensus, but rather one of endemic inconclusivity. So political actors, in pursuit of the widespread support required in democracies to gain or maintain office, have little choice other than to invoke differing normative stances and policies, despite the fact that they are contradictory. As Margaret Levi has sardonically observed, bad policies are often good politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very pleased to report that we are running precisely on time and that we have exactly 1 hour for Q&A. So in that spirit, I'd like to abuse my prerogative as moderator to throw the first question out. It seemed to me that we've had 3 rather sobering, if not depressing, presentations on government responses to extremism. So in the interest of injecting a little optimism or sunshine into the discussion, I'd like to ask our panelists if there are any governments that have been getting this right. Is there any reason to think that somewhere out there some policymakers have found a solution to these problems, and that there is a story out there that's not just a tale of bad politics and bureaucratic bungling?
It is a depressing thing to think about globally. And I want to be really clear that the question that you're asking is the question that we've asked every single day since 9/11. There is no silver bullet. Okay, there are new patterns emerging day by day in terms of how the bad guys are utilizing the open world that we live in to get into the space that they want to get into. So what might have worked yesterday will not work, let's suppose, 2 weeks from now. But what you should feel optimistic about is that we know a couple of things. One is this pairing of the off and online that I talked about. That might seem really obvious, but governments are increasingly getting the fact that you can't just do this one-dimensionally, that you have to understand that there is, we have to mirror things. We have many of our partners and allies understand that it's local, so it's the grassroots up, not top down. That is a positive thing that may seem super obvious as well, but it took us a long time to use your terminology, policy messiness. There is a problem, a push and pull, with the responsible reaction to how we design what needs to happen and the messy, ugly, ridiculous politics of what needs to be done. So that's been the problem. Now, if you want a country that's done it really well, no, there are none. But they're bits and bobs of different parts. I could tell you, boy, along those lines, often online, local governments, malleability, moving fast, creativity. We know that one-on-one interventions work. We know that former extremists work. We know that, using algorithms to put new content in front of kids that are searching matters. We know these are good things. So, in fact, many of the European governments that you just described have actually invested in some of these small, but the problem is that the big problem here is scale. And that's the one word I want to leave you with. It's not that at the end of 2017, there's no silver bullet, what do we do? It's, wow, there's promise in all of these things, but we've done nothing at scale, so we don't even know what it would be like if we actually did this. So I think as problematic as some of the positioning, our government even today, and you are spot on with your assessment, by the way, even today, there is promise in some of the things that we know local communities can do, and that was made available by some of the interventions that have happened with our government. There are some really good possibilities in the UK and France and Germany in the messy world that we're living in, but there isn't a place on the planet where we've tested at scale, even at the most micro level, for even 6 months to say, we've gone all in, we're doing everything we can, let's see what it feels like. And that's the big problem.
I'll just add to that very briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely nuggets at the local, and really sometimes it's even down to the individual level. I mean, you hear about just an amazing imam who literally spends the time that they're not doing their job and doing everything else they do, late at night online, communicating with wayward youth and trying to explain to them why ISIS's narrative is inconsistent with traditional historic Islamic principles and Islamic teachings and the language of the Quran. So you have these nuggets of brilliance, and I'll give one other international example. I spent a good chunk of the summer in Morocco, and are there problems in Morocco? Is the king oppressing some protests up in the north? Absolutely. But he's also taken some very interesting steps with the Ministry of Religion, and if you can do it, and if there's something to do, at least you can get something done. Unlike this mess in the U.S., in a dictatorship, you can tell people what you want them to do. And I think he had some very open-minded, creative ideas about how we could use his authority in the Ministry of Religion to develop and propagate a better understanding, more inclusive understanding of Islam. Of course, he has Islamist parties that are very powerful in the government, and he's working to keep them at bay. But so anyway, there are examples of positive things, but I totally agree with everything Farah said about scaling. It doesn't exist.
All right, thanks. I'm happy to turn it over to you for questions.
In the search of some good information, I'm Mike Bennett, a retired Foreign Service officer, and I visited a project in Vienna, Austria about 3 years ago that my daughter had been involved in, and had been ongoing for about 3 years, trying to address the social problems of homeless refugees, in most cases more Muslim than not. They provided them housing and food and job training, and what was sort of a surprise to me, trained them as local tour guides while they were looking for more permanent employment. And since a lot of the new people to the city were Muslim, those tours went off with quite a few people, and it developed their confidence, their language ability, and helped some of the new refugees and homeless people feel better. Now you have the recent election, so maybe that wasn't a big enough scale project to be useful.
Yes, please.
A question directed more towards Farah. With USAID and their CVE program, we're familiar with, of course, what they've done in West Africa, but some of the CVE programs on moderate voices, community cohesion, bringing in youth engagement events. And can we use that as sort of a start, a marker of relative success? Do you consider it relative success? And do you think that there would be a domestic equivalent to that? And what would that look like?
Do you remember when I told you I was going to be a pain in the neck? This is the part. I worked at AID twice. In the H.W. Bush administration, right out of college, I was honored to have my first toe in the water at USAID, and they do incredible work. And I returned after 9/11 to serve my country, and I went directly to AID. So I've spent a lot of time there. I also was posted in Afghanistan after 9/11 with aid. So my comments are not a reflection of an incredible agency that has done extraordinary work, punching way above their weight in the thing that they're supposed to do, which is economic and humanitarian aid. I believe AID should do economic and humanitarian aid. That is what it was designed to do. It is what your taxpayer dollar go toward. There is great need to do that work all over the world. So, you know, when you heard the really beautiful illustration of how we have evolved on CVE and what's taken place, after the summit, you were very polite. I'm not going to be so polite. After the summit, there was a food frenzy for the money and the interest and the time and the energy to be known as a CVE deliverer within government, within the interagency. So all of these agencies and departments that would not touch this during the Bush administration, when we were pushing every single arm of the government to pay attention to soft power, to see what they could do with the lines of money that Congress had given them to allocate to helping kids not find this appealing, would look the other way, turned and looked directly at CVE and said, hi, we do that too. Now, all of the programs to build resilience and youth development is awesome and it's terrific. But here's the problem. You cannot do CVE if there's a US flag on everything that we do. It doesn't work like that. So what's my problem with AID doing this work? We have to put the US flag on everything that we do. It's brought to you by AID, okay? Local NGOs don't want the AID logo on there. They don't want American footprints all over everything that they do. We need to have, and the reason why we screwed up so badly after 9/11 with the deployment of the model that was going to work, the method that was going to work, is because we couldn't figure out how to give the money to the NGOs to do the job that they needed to do without the US government getting in their way. You can't tell an NGO what to say and how to say it. It doesn't work like that. So, no. The answer is no. I don't think that's the answer. I think that AID should do what they want to do, and if you would allow me, you asked a really awesome question about Saudi Arabia in the last panel, and I'd like to say something about Saudi, because I didn't during my 20 minutes, so let me just take a minute and say this to you. I talked to you when I started about there was one data point that connected every single country that I visited, over 80 countries around the world, whether it was a Muslim majority country or a Muslim living as a minority. That was the issue of identity. The second major influence everywhere in the world was Saudi Arabia, and the investment of the Wahhabi ideology transported through a multitude of different dimensions for over 30 years has dramatically shifted the way Muslims think about themselves and what they think Islam is. And if we don't get that, I don't see the professor who was speaking earlier about Bruce, if he was here. But he made an excellent point about how we have to reimagine our relationship with Saudi Arabia. That is the core, in my view, of how we unpack this entire issue. People have missed the boat in understanding what's happening with the global trends with Muslim millennials and now Generation Z. So I'm so happy you asked that question, and I don't know if you're a student, but I urge you to go deeper on that issue and connect the dots.
So I know we were looking for bright spots, but I think we have to consider, let's say we had the a machine to clone 1,000 Farahs, and we could, also a budget to give her to go out and do, an amazing amount of good works. How much of that amazing work is undone by a president coming and holding the globe, the orb, with King Salman from Saudi Arabia and Sisi, who has thrown 10,000 Muslim Brotherhood in jail without charge indefinitely. So this is a big problem, but I'm a big believer that this has to be an integrated solution, and I don't know how we do the soft power part until we figure out how to align our foreign policies with it.
Comments or questions? Yes, please.
I very much appreciated your talking about what is and what is not CVE. And I think your narrative explained why the confusion in a lot of people's mind. But the problem is, we never got a dime to spend, but were tagged with what people thought CVE was. The label has now become so toxic that even if the budget comes back, how do we, do we have to just come up with a new name for it? How do we rehabilitate the very idea of what CVE is?
Yes, we need a new brand. It's dead, you're right. I don't think you can use that brand. I don't know what Farah thinks, but in the other paper we wrote about community policing, we mentioned that specifically that the brand was toxic, and that we tried to come up with something else. Maybe the brilliant person who sat in a room and came up with USA Patriot Act, that uniting and preventing terrorism and so on. Maybe we get them to work on a better acronym for CVE. But I think we need to kind of start again a little bit on that, if we get the chance. I've got a quick question for Farah. How do you prevent, let's say again, we got the budget and we got programs going, and we've got government entities that are giving money to NGOs to do all the right things. How do you prevent the taint of the government, the recipient of government funds? Because that's public, everybody knows that. Is that possible? Can the NGOs get around that?
So it's a great question. My book is called How We Win, because I do believe we can win. I agree that there is a complexity around CVE, and what I'm terrified about is a 3-year conversation within the interagency trying to figure out what the right term is. And I know that will happen. I'm sorry, that is going to happen. So I actually feel like, okay, can we rehabilitate the way in which we talk about this and the way we bring different actors and reimagine who the actors are. So when I've talked about opening power to everyone, I really want to see us create monies that will allow, because we know that NGOs are the answer, it's not government doing anything. So how can we give NGOs the kind of money that they need to do this at scale? And it isn't just government. So I know, because I've worked very closely with a lot of the leading NGOs who are in this space and have done work, including the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And for those of you who are actually interested in the connection between the kind of extremism we're talking about right now and far-right extremism, they just put out an incredible paper today that you should, instituteforstrategicdialogue.org or something, go look at it. But they're taking money from governments, European governments, to do very specific kind of work. And so I've watched NGOs work so hard to try to get the money that they need to keep the lights on, to pay the salaries, these are people who, imagine the emotional toll of looking at beheadings and thinking about all the work that they have to do to actually get the counter content up online. And they, at the same time as the governments are leaning on them to do the work, they have to try to raise money to keep the lights on and pay the salaries and think about these things. So they have to take government money. But it's not the only money that exists in the world. And so I know that everybody talks about, the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters and the Microsofts who are in fact doing some CVE work and grants, and there are a multitude of NGOs that are doing things. But I didn't mention the word philanthropies. And here we are in America, the greatest, most generous country in the world around philanthropy, and you can't get them to fund NGOs that are doing things at scale, and it boggles the mind. They will do interfaith, which is great, and we want that. And they will do the softest end of the softest part of soft power, but they won't do the kind of work that we know that what will work at scale. And so we're to the money issue, I want to see not just the largest foundations say, listen, if the Open Society just gets $18 billion to build resilience and strong communities, what part of that is going to go towards debunking and puncturing the us versus them, period? When you talk about individual donations, are we thinking about, and are we asking regular companies to think more creatively? So they can take money from government, and they will if it's transparent, and this is the most important part, answer to your question, if the content is not touched by the obligation of the money that they receive. So give all the money you can to keep the lights on and pay the salaries, but don't tell us what to put in the content. And then they can take the money. There are some NGOs also who take a step further. We will take money from governments that are transparent, and we know where that money came from. We won't take money from countries that violate a series of things that they don't find, correct. So there is hope in that, but it's not happening yet.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to actually ask a question about learning, and the reason why I ask is because recently I heard Sir David Omand, who created our counter-terrorism strategy, which consists of PREVENT, which is your equivalent to countering violent extremism. Everything he said about why PREVENT failed in the UK is exactly what you've said here this afternoon. Now, he introduced that in 2003. Did anyone in the United States have an opportunity to talk to Sir David, to actually ask him about what he thought you needed to do to make what failed in the UK work in the United States? Because obviously you've initiated your program several years later. I just wanted to...
One thing I will say to you is that we tested the model of asking locals to take this on and create the kind of influencing narratives and programs that will make a difference at the community level in the latter part of the Bush administration. In fact, right after the Danish cartoon crisis, when all of us, the world, freaked out, this is pre-Twitter, that something that happened in Copenhagen could have an effect in a life in Kabul. And when that happened, all of the European governments were like, and the Danes, you can imagine the Danes, why are they coming after us in embassies around the world? We're the Danes. Everybody loves us, right? So America launched an experiment. We said, first of all, Dan Fried, Ambassador Dan Fried, and Juan Zarate, and Elliot Abrams, and Kurt Volker, and Matt Bryza said, we don't know enough about what might work. We know what kind of happened during the Cold War in the way in which we approached providing counter content. But what is the model now? How do we think about that? And this is before PREVENT, okay? This is, around the same time, and I know this because I was the guinea pig that went to Europe to test it. So I worked very closely with the UK government in understanding what models can work at the local level. How do you build a network of like-minded thinkers? How do we think about this? This is why we knew everything we knew by the time Obama came to be Obama. And why I'm so sad that it took so many years for them to listen to the lessons that we learned. But that's a different point. What you're saying is important, but what's so different about the UK, there are three nations in Europe that are complete outliers to all of the, one is Europe, one is France, and one is Spain. And I can talk to you offline on why those three are very, very different. But on the UK side, the colonial weight is so severe, and the Muslims in the UK are now on their 5th generation. It's a very different dynamic, and so when you talk to the government in the UK, the dimensions of this issue are very different than things that we have learned and we can experience here in the United States. There have been back and forth between our programs, what's working, how do we copy the things that have worked well, how do we reject the things that haven't. But it's very dangerous for the United States or the UK to say, let us mobilize the same kind of program in both of our countries, because our genesis story, our experience about who we are is so different. And secondly, and this is vital, Islam has been part of the United States since the United States was born. And that isn't the case in the UK. And so there is a very different feeling. American Muslims are the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere in the world. And we have not, as America, understood that in the normal day-to-day, but as government, what we were trying to do, both in the Bush and the Obama administration, is to go back to that sense of self in terms of who we are as we thought about this program. It did not take off the way we wanted it to, but there's a dimension that's very, very different.
Gentleman back here, please.
I've got two foils for thought. One is I'm wondering whether, borrowing from the healthcare arena, where value-based insurance design, incentive design, is designed to pay providers for long-term success outcomes, including preventive medicine, treatment, and so on. And I'm wondering whether that applies here, where the outcome is viewed, and the outcome doesn't necessarily occur synchronously with the expenses and the investment of intervention. So and from the second side, and forgive me if my reading of history is wrong, it seems that in Turkey, for instance, that Erdogan's strength and popularity came from his first 8 years or so in power, where he allowed competent people to exert their influence, and that then he rode the power base that built down. So forgive me if that is not an accurate reading. And but anyway, those are two. I'd be interested in your thinking of how that might apply to CBE.
So you want to try to get better results by modeling things after the United States healthcare system? That was the thrust of the first question. I'd say we shouldn't do that.
Yes, the difficulty is that one doesn't know, it's hard to pin the cause and effect. I mean,
listen, there's no doubt you need to have a program. You need to try a lot of different things, and then you also have to be simultaneously evaluating them. And matter of fact, we've had some really smart people who were tasked to come up with, how do we design even metrics for trying to figure out if different CVE interventions are working. I mean, because a terrorist incident that didn't occur is unmeasurable, right? So, this is a very, very difficult concept, and you can't figure it out unless you try a lot of different things, you evaluate them, you learn from your mistakes, you try again, and so on, and that takes a lot of time. And, people looking for the silver bullet, and congressmen are demanding, nobody does cost-benefit analysis on the defense budget to decide how's the war in Yemen working out for us. We're going to cut your funding unless you can demonstrate that it's made us safer. Well, that never happens. But try to get $10–15 million out of Congress for a social program experiment, and they'll demand, what are the metrics? Prove to us that you're actually getting results. So, there lies the problem.
That's a
And I
problem.
can't answer your question about Turkey.
With a lot. Yeah, by the way, the issue of the event that didn't occur, that's also a natural health-related outcome. The death that didn't happen up to now may happen in the future, and survival analysis, time dependent.
Well, there is a whole school of thought, and I think my colleague Steve Wine from the University of Chicago is coming out with a book saying, looking at CVE from a public health perspective, looking at like issues of primary, secondary, tertiary kinds of intervention, depending on how people. And I said this once at a conference, and boy, did I get dirty looks. But it is definitely an important model we might be able to draw on
What's
here.
the name again?
His name, well, it's not out yet. Steve Wine, W-E-I-N-E, from University of Illinois. I don't know, one of those. Yeah. Champaign Urbano.
So Farah was talking about the need of granular, and I love your idea of 1,000 farmers going out, but then you also touched on the global, which is the Googles and all the internet. So how do you handle, where's government going to come in to handle all the news and the fake news and so forth we hear so much about?
Do you mean in terms of making sure that there's no content online that can?
Well, we keep hearing about it, the problems with it. So what's the solution?
Well, interestingly, Europe has led the way on restrictions for these companies in creating a public outcry that they need to do more. Our First Amendment is important to us as Americans, and that I'm telling you some things you already know. So that navigation is complicated, but because Europe has already started a standard approach to the way in which they're looking at hate speech, excuse me, I'm thinking about his question, hate speech, it's forcing the companies to be more proactive than they would have. You can't take all the content down. Okay, that is not the answer. And by the way, even when you try to, and I'm not saying don't take any content down, I'm simply saying the content that's already, the Aulaki videos on YouTube, if you took everything out, which they've tried to do, they're out there in deep spaces that you can get them. And by the way, people keep forgetting, you don't have to have the latest technology, okay? You can still use a DVD, and you can still use things that we don't think kids use anymore. It's everything in between. So it's outpacing the content that's going up and actually redesigning the algorithms so that you're putting things in front of the kids that will move them in a direction you want them to go, the same way you get them to buy whatever it is. It's the same technology. We haven't applied it to this problem, incredibly, okay? We have not applied it to this problem. I want to bring up, you talked about the health sort of parallel. I want us to think about this in terms of the online space, the way we think of pedophilia, okay? You teach a young child what to go, your parents are paranoid about what their kids are looking at, how they're looking at it. We're not teaching that kind of hygiene, that online hygiene, to the most vulnerable kids of any kind of extremist group. This is a new world we're living in. And so part of the answer has got to be these companies have got to help society work on the hygiene of how parents and kids understand the bad guys preying upon them, not for sex, but for radicalization purposes.
I have a problem with staying.
No,
you're
second.
Sorry, wait a minute. Hold on. We're interrupted.
So, can I ask, how do you develop that, the counter content? How do you do that and distribute it?
It's not one thing, and that's where a lot of people make a huge mistake. Government began by saying, well, if we only tell them this, everybody will like us. They just understood how great America is for Muslims. This is way back right after 9/11, by the way, not now. We're the most free country in the world. There's synagogues and temples and churches on every block. I mean, you've heard that whole thing. If we just tell them that, the kids won't realize that, okay, it doesn't work like that. Kids, as you know, listen to what other kids are saying. So the kind of content that we create for the programs in a multitude of different ways, music, poetry, cartoons, games, one-on-one video, I mean, a bunch of different methods, but the content comes from their peers themselves to talk in a way, so there's a religious argument, there is a social argument, there's an in-group, out-group argument, there's a cool, not cool argument. I mean, go through every component of human behavior and what an adolescent kid deals with. You're gonna see everything in there. For some kids, it's gonna be that religious, I wanna understand religiously what Islam has to say. And so that's why the cleric able to deconstruct the arguments of ISIS makes a difference. For other kids, they don't know anything about Islam, but they actually heard someone say, who said something else, who said this particular rumor about whatever it is culturally, and they're supposed to do, well, the only way you're gonna get to that kid is to hear it a different way. So, you know, hip-hop artists, graffiti artists, all kinds of things that government has a really hard time putting their hands around, they are the deliverers of the message and the content creators that come from those creatives. And I want to go back and leave you, because I just saw what time it is. We're done. The most credible content are former extremists. Okay, and unfortunately, we have a lot of former extremists out there. The tragedy is we have not figured out how to pay the former extremists for the time and energy we need them to invest in helping us mine the content and create the counter, programs to make this happen.
Which that was one of the grants that the Trump administration canceled on right-wing extremism to this group Life Without Hate, which is comprised entirely of former white extremists. And apparently they didn't think that was a good idea, a good expenditure of government money.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I think if you're thinking of a really big concept, we have to redefine our definition of we. And it has to include Islam and it has to include Muslims. Instead of being, you're here in our country now. It has to go very far back. It has to include the monotheistic, the Abrahamic religions. That Islam's not the enemy. It's part of the same story of human development. And it has to involve Muslims. It can't be something created by non-Muslims and then sold to them or something like that. So they have to be involved in the project. But I think for me, that's a metaphor of a new wheat. You could probably sell a lot of T-shirts with that too. In terms of selling to them. I wish. Why don't companies realize that this huge market is there?
Oh, I've tried this. That's a whole other panel on that.
I mean, you've got billions.
We have time for a few more questions if there are any. At the back of the room.
I mean, it's a great suggestion you just made, but do you have any practical suggestions? Because to me, it seems this idea of defining we is a fantastic idea, but right now we see a total crisis of identity and like what James Rosenow called globalization going both ways. So I just don't see it absolutely implementable today, what you've just suggested. Do you have any idea how to do it?
But I do. Wait a minute. So you're saying that you don't think that there's a way, or sorry, I heard you correctly, that we can't redefine we?
I don't think today we can, yeah. I mean, I'm going to talk later on the next panel about it, but I think it's extremely...
So,
yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful to do it. I wish we could do it, but I don't think there is a way, at least today in the contemporary environment for the next maybe couple of decades, there is absolutely no way. It's going the other way around.
I totally disagree, sir.
Okay.
There are a lot of really bad actors, no question about it, in every society. And there will be people who are getting paid and paying others to provoke the us and them in every possible way, not just the kind of extremism I'm talking about. I used to talk about a youthquake that I heard, that I experienced in my travels as special representative, because I was so inspired by the way young people were talking about the planet that they want to be on. And I am not talking about rainbows and unicorns and dancing horses, I promise. But the we is society, each community, it's really, really granular. And every community needs to decide, and I'm not talking about Muslim versus not, I meant all of us, how we want to be and what we stand for. And I see hope in that. I see hope in the change and the craziness that's happened in the United States with the polarization of things that are happening. The communities that never came together are coming back together again to say, I may not agree with everything that you stand for, but we've got to do more. So I don't think you can change and revolutionize the world, but I think we can make progress in changing the us and them, and I think that's what you mean by some of the we. So sorry.
But it seems like, you just brought up the example of the United States. I think the United States is a great example that we actually came to polarization, which we haven't seen since the time of civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. I've been in this country for over 20 years, and I never realized now I move in the South. I'd say in Fayetteville in the South, but it's a total culture shock. I would say moving from Boston to Fayetteville is equal like from moving from Boston to Peshawar. So I would say polarization.
You're getting really popular here.
I don't buy your optimism for some reason.
I know that it's sort of hard to swallow at times,
Right.
and it's very depressing. And I grew up outside of Boston, by the way. And I know and I've seen the changes that have happened and the questions that have been asked of me. I wasn't born in this country, but I grew up in Massachusetts. I've had people tell me that I speak English very well recently, which I find really encouraging. That's great. I'm glad my accent's okay. But at the same time, there's Boston strong. At the same time that the bomb went off on Boylston Street, Bostonians stood up and ran. So there's a good and there's a bad. We just got to make sure that there's more good.
I can give a concrete project would be, for instance, one right now going on in Berlin where they're building a spiritual, religious place that will be neither Christian, Muslim, nor Jewish. It'll be shared by all three of them. So that kind of practical, and I think that's privately funded. I don't know, if government's behind. I don't think that is privately funded. I think they've got plans for building it. That's still working on all the funding, but there, a little thing. When in 9th grade you go to learn algebra, and somebody ought to tell you the origins of algebra. That was the Islamic world that gave us algebra. Those things can be done, but it takes to include them in what we consider to be us.
I can mention that.
Just one quick comment.
So, no, I agree we live in a harsh, tough society, but the one thing I would recommend, and I try to do in my everyday life, in my teaching, is that the clash of civilization narrative is a death spiral.
Right.
And everybody who knows better needs to confront that and confront the people who propagate it either out of laziness, the fact that they are uneducated, or for cynical political purposes, need to have to confront that and explain themselves and be forced to answer hard questions. And I think that's incumbent. The younger generation, they're not into that. They don't believe in that stuff, and that's great. But they're not going to be in power and making big decisions for another 10 or 20 years. But those of us who are our age, we need to confront that very hard, very directly, I think.
Yeah, just briefly, what you said about that initiative in Berlin, these are very good initiatives and we all like them, of course.
Scale.
Whatever. Not scale, yeah, that's right. But how big the effect is on the people on the ground, particularly young people, but also older people, I wonder very much. You quoted Berlin, but at the same time you see the entry of a really almost Nazi party into the German federal parliament for the first time ever since the Second World War. So that seems to be an obvious contrast. You go to this country and we can find nice, good initiatives we all approve of, but then we also have Charlottesville and similar things. And then that divides, that seems to polarize society. What I think is really essential is, and that was really the lesson I got from Northern Ireland, where I lived many years, and there also, as you know, was a terrorist problem, there still is, or a different one. They said you have to catch them at school. You have to catch them when they grow up, when their parents and the teachers together have really a great influence then, probably starting long before the teen years, really when they enter school. That is when you can either radicalize them or anti-radicalize them. Once they get into their later teens, I think it is a very difficult battle which is almost impossible to win, as it seems at the moment.
Well, this is on an optimistic note here. Ethnographers, anthropologists, geographers are doing really great work about something that they call everyday multiculturalism. And regardless of what the policies are, they're going into neighborhoods and they're finding people who have to live close to one another, who are of very different views, and religious views, for instance. And they're finding out things like, for instance, they have a big celebration in a neighborhood to in Berlin, for instance, I know that best, but to end Ramadan, and now the non-Muslim neighbors are coming. They're getting really interested. Or you have everyday multiculturalism in the sense of, I never expected that my son would marry a Muslim woman, but he has, and now I have a grandchild, and that changes the way you think about these things. So there's a little bit of optimistic hope there in terms of, and that's nothing the government's doing, it's just happening because human beings are just coming together a lot more. So I mean, I'm glad to see ethnographers are finding this out. They're talking about also this concept of super diversity now, and that you often have in large cities as many as 100 different languages being spoken on a regular basis. And these people just can't avoid bumping into each other. And so sometimes they bump into each other and they're angry and mean and ugly, but a lot of times they're not. Your favorite bakery is owned by a Muslim person, for instance, and you start talking to them, and so that might be some hope there.
Yes. This is a question specifically for Farah. You mentioned that when the CVE program was initially being conceptualized and created, the U.S. government didn't have a role for mental health experts in the development of that program. I'm curious to know how you think mental health experts should be involved, because I don't know of any evidence-based practices that are proved to work for de-radicalization or that are geared towards that target population.
Super question, thank you. I urge you to read the Homeland Security Advisory Council's 2016 CVE Task Force report for a very detailed analysis of how a 50-state plan would work, including the mental health component. That's point one. Point two is America has spectacular scientists who understand adolescent and child brain development. And the application of science and what's happening to human behavior parallel with the ethnographers, the anthropologists, that go on and on and on, is what I was advocating for. You cannot do this in a one-dimensional way and say, we're just gonna talk to the experts on the Middle East, as noble as they are, to figure out what's happening. The human experience of getting radicalized and why they're getting radicalized and identity may not be a field that's 70 years old or 100 years old, but there are elements of it that can be used for a better plan here in the United States and in fact around the world. I want to be also very clear that there is no other country in the world that has applied the kind of expertise of science to this issue. One of the things that we advocated for in that report for Secretary Johnson was the development of a center within the United States that could do the kind of research with a multitude of hospitals and and experts to look at, if you look at like the Broad Institute in the Boston area, who is a multi-dimensional facility to look at the next phase of what's going to happen with diseases, to do the same kind of thing in terms of the adolescent and child mind. So that's what we're advocating for. That's what I'm advocating for, and the need to really go far deeper. I want to say one other thing that might be controversial, and I'm not at all an expert and I'm not a scientist, but we didn't talk about gender at all today. So I want to just bring that up for three reasons. One, you heard earlier about the example of Morocco and the kinds of things that are happening in Morocco. One of the things you didn't say, which I know you know, but one of the interesting elements in the work that they're doing is to provide, and they've been doing this since 9/11. I can't remember the Arabic word for it, but even before 9/11, there is it's sort of a social. They're females that have been trained. They're like female clerics that have been trained to help kids understand Islam, and they're women, right? And so they have a different dimension to the way in which they interact with a young person, and that's a model that's specifically Moroccan, that we should be replicating all over the world. And we haven't looked at the radicalization of what's happening to women. That's a completely different phenomenon in many ways, but it's also very similar. But we haven't seen the dimensional changes there, and we haven't applied the gender differences there, which connect to the issue that you're talking about in terms of brain science. There is a difference between the female and male brains, and how they develop and when they develop, and the impact of things that are happening in society in terms of how they behave. Why haven't we applied that to the way in which we're looking at the answers for this issue and what we need to have on the table? Not surprisingly, everything is male-oriented because of the way we are on this planet. But time is now to be innovative and creative about how we prepare and what we should be doing in a better way.
Is there another question at the back?
No, I just wanted to make a really brief comment. I didn't want you to misunderstand me that I'm clearly 100% with you with what you were saying. I was just saying that it doesn't sound convincing that in the current situation it works. And in the case of Berlin, like for example, I lived in Berlin for 3 years, and there are areas of Berlin, I mean, those projects are fascinating, but at the same time, I mean, if you've been to Hermannstrasse in Berlin, there are internet shops separate for men and women, and where there are no signs in German or English. And it's actually quite scary to be there, like during any time of the day, I would say. So, I mean, Berlin, even the most cosmopolitan city of Germany, is also has, I mean, we don't have those kind of situations in the United States, to my knowledge. I've never seen those kind of ghettos. And Berlin, of course, is one of the probably most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. So, I mean, that's all I just wanted to clarify. Please.
I've often noticed that in various conflicts around the world that you have to be very similar to be diametrically opposite on just one thing. And so I wonder about fleshing out other dimensions in which disagreement is absent, even though it could be there from another side. Joshua Green from the Boston area has pointed out that when he prompts people to evaluate a problem in detail and then state their position, they end up being much more moderate than when they are just asked abruptly that same question. So I'm wondering whether...
We're almost out of time, so why don't we take one last question? I think our cameraman actually has I'll ask the panelists to respond to all of these comments.
I think it's just interesting when you consider like the necessary response of, like we talked about politicians and like response to terror attacks. And I think, like, what do you think the cultural change needs to be to not overplay and play into the hands of the like extremists, while also still recognizing the event as like a tragedy? And I think that like what needs to happen for that culture change to be able for a president to not necessarily talk all the time about an event in that way.
Who would like to start?
Well, I'll work on this one. I was just thinking about this the other day, and with respect to the New York City attack, in terms of the fact that I think we moved on very quickly. It was a horrible attack. I don't live in New York now. I used to, but you know, it was the worst attack since 9/11, and 8 people were killed. But I feel like we are learning that this is unfortunately part of modern life. I don't think we should ever accept it and find that acceptable. But I think we realize that, you know, we can't prevent all of these things. I think society is just beginning to accept at least these low-level things as part of modern life and understand that we have to move on quickly and live our lives. And I think that's a good thing. So maybe we are becoming a little bit more psychologically resilient. And if that's true, then the politicization of these events won't work as much.
One of the things that both of my colleagues talked about the clash of civilizations, and the underlying narrative there is an us versus them. Maren and I have spent 2 decades in public service and very closely staffing a president to make sure that statements that come out of the White House are as responsible as we can be in terms of measuring both the sincerity of the person delivering the message and the clarity of what's happening and the dimensions that won't play into the bad guys' narratives. I mean, all those things that you have to navigate. So it is hard and it's complicated, but at its source, nothing can be believed if the person who is saying the words cannot demonstrate in his or her actions, in other things, that they believe what they say. And importantly, around this issue and what EQ or ISIS or any other group, Boko, Shabab, any of these groups want to do, is to prove to their potential recruits and to the people that they have recruited that in fact America is at war with Islam. So in everything that we do, in everything that we say, in the lexicon, in all of the touch points that come out of the White House, we have to debunk that narrative. So I go even a step further than that, and I've been increasingly clear about the importance of words. And what I'm saying to you as a millennial is your words matter. When I was in graduate school, we used to use the term Muslim world all the time. It's what we did, it's how I wrote my master's thesis. I mean, it was like normal. But think about that for 1 minute. When you say the term Muslim world, what does that say? It says that there's a world over here that Muslims live, and there's another world in which they don't. And when that light bulb went off for me, I became crazy on the issue of lexicon. So it takes more words for me to say Muslim communities around the world, but I will keep saying it because the words matter. So I would say to you that in what the president says, or our congressmen and women, we have to make sure we use longer terms and phrases if we have to, but that we do not give them, we do not cede ground on this idea of us versus them.
Yeah, I would just add to that, for instance, contextualization. And okay, you say it's terrible what happened in New York, but then mention that in the same week there have been so many hate crimes against Muslims in the United States, or how many have died in other countries, or something like that. To contextualize it and always say that it's not just us against them. It's not only our so-called fatalities matter. That they really are. We care about all human beings, and we really have a different definition of the we, right?
One brief final question. Please.
Well, we'll see how brief. I'd like to follow up on Professor Shanzer's comment about resilience. As opposed to Europe, I think the United States accepts much more violence in its society. I'm not sure about the value of life that we apply in the United States versus Europe. Look at the gun violence that we have. And we're very resilient about that. We seem to find it unable to do anything about it, even in spite of Newtown, Las Vegas. Look at healthcare. Europe has single payer. We can't seem to find it in our will to give the poorest in our society what others in the world have. So we have resilience. And I guess I wonder, with regard to the violence that the Al-Qaeda and ISIS are giving us, we'll ultimately accept that as well. And as Professor Hoffman has suggested, you know, maybe we're overplaying that at this point when there are so many other more important things in this society. If you have any comments, feel free.
We have 2 minutes left, so I'll invite our panelists to make a brief final comment.
You want me to lose my job? No, I mean, fair comments. Actually, I don't think that's what Professor Hoffman was saying, though. I mean, Professor Hoffman was kind of saying he thought we needed to double down and do more, that we could actually bring this to a, some sort of conclusion. And, I'm a bit dubious about that. I think we are a bit stuck, and this is a long-term conflict, and I think we have to talk about something a politician could never admit, but our ultimate goal is really to contain and mitigate this form of violence. Unfortunately, we're not going to defeat it. All of Farah's initiatives, I think, are necessary just to mitigate and contain, and rather than to see it increase. But we have a limited set of solutions in our toolkit. There's a limited amount of resources the world and our country is going to expend towards this compared to the other things that you mentioned. And therefore, since it's not existential threat, we are going to kind of muddle through, and that's kind of how I see the future. It's not a cheery way to end on, but also I think it's good for us to understand that this is a bad thing. It's a lot worse for many parts of the rest of the world than it is for the United States. But that's kind of how I see the future going forward.
You're welcome. What's the #1 killer in the United States?
Heart disease.
Heart disease. You know how much more we spend on the war on terrorism have we spent since 9/11 than on heart disease? 30,000 times more. 30,000 times more. I think you're right.
All right, on that cheery and sobering note, please join me in thanking our panelists for